Hello and welcome to Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin, and today we're going to be talking about the subject of property management. Now, how many times have we heard, oh dear, my service charge is too high, or oh dear, my managing agents aren't doing a great job? Well, I've got somebody with me today, Phil Crawford, who's an expert in leasehold matters. Welcome to you, Phil.
Thank you.
Phil's going to be taking us through the rights and wrongs of property management and how we may cure some of the problems that we come across. Phil, the first thing I want to do is for our viewers is to sort of really explain the role of a managing agent.
In blocks of flats, predominantly, there are managing agents who look after the shared areas, the communal areas, gardens, and flat owners pay managing agents for that service. So they collect service charge money to look after the maintenance of the building. They deal with repairs, insurance, cleaning, gardening, and other matters relating to the communal areas of the building. And it's usually blocks of flats.
Okay. I'm going to sort of cheat here. I know one of the questions I'm going to ask you later on, where the relevance of what I'm going to ask you now will become more important. Who actually employs the managing agents? Often, because people pay a service charge, they presume that they're employing the managing agents, but more often than not, it's the freeholder or the landlord that employs the managing agent.
Generally, it's the landlord who employs the managing agent to act for him in looking after the building. It's often not the flat owners who employ the managing agent, despite the fact they pay service charge to them.
Yeah, okay. But I think the sort of misunderstanding comes is because they're actually paying that managing agent via the service charge. They assume some kind of relationship is there, but as often as not, it's not there, is it? It's not part of the structure. Again, for the benefit of our viewers, I should explain that the difference between freehold and leasehold is this. A leasehold is often as not these days 999 years. It's done that way so that some individual has got control over the well-being of the building. I think that would be a good word to use. And once they've done that, and that managing agent's appointed, it's quite a big job to actually ever change them, isn't it?
The managing agents, it depends on the setup of the managing agent. That there are opportunities to change the managing agent. There's a right to manage.
Yes.
Whereas 50% of flat owners can get together and they could initiate a right to manage, to remove the managing agent.
I understand that, and I think from what we've explained, our viewers will probably get that too. But the real problem comes when the residents don't feel that a managing agent is doing its job. Now, as I've said, freehold, leasehold, one, you own your property outright and everything to do with it's down to you, it's your problem, you deal with it. That's a normal household's problem.
Yeah.
Where it's leasehold, as I say, the whole idea of that is to give one person control, a sort of accountable body that looks after the building, makes sure it's always in a good state and takes care of those parts you mentioned, the common parts, the gardens and the facilities within the building. But we're always hearing that we're paying too much for this, the agent's not doing the job, all the rest of it. You say quite rightly, Phil, well, you have got the right to manage. If you can get a 50% majority, you can get it. But, and there is a big but there, if we look at some of these big buildings behind us here with 500 or 600 flats in a building, you can bet your bottom dollar that 50 or 60% of them, if not a few more, are owned by people in Asia Pacific areas, or Hong Kong, wherever. And getting hold of those people to get a collective majority to get something done, pretty impossible, isn't it?
Not practical.
No.
Not really practical.
So actually, the right to manage hasn't got a lot of teeth, has it really?
It probably has more teeth in smaller blocks. In big blocks, I think the reality is it's very difficult, as you say, to assemble 50% of owners who share the same view. and want to do that right to manage.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is whoever's trying to instigate right to manage might also have a problem getting a list of all the contents from the developer. I've heard so many times the developer say, oh, no, I can't possibly give you that information. It's against the Data Protection Act. However, I think by law it's actually excluded, isn't it, from data?
I believe it is excluded.
Yeah, so
they're not volunteering it.
No. I've heard
reasons.
I've heard some really funny excuses as to why they can't hand it over. Use of paper, not good for our eco credentials. Oh, it's just nonsense.
Yeah.
And it's people wanting to keep hold of that management facility.
Yeah.
Because if it is not run correctly, it can be abused.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking here, how many times have we seen the case of managing agents saying, right, we do the insurance for the building, you've got to pay for it. Is there a commission paid on that? Shouldn't be. But there often is. One way or another. It could be by way of perhaps a director's home insurance being paid for, in a different way. We've heard all sorts of complaints of that kind of thing. And the real problem, Phil, and one of the reasons that you're here today and we're welcoming your input, is there doesn't seem to be anywhere to go with these problems.
That's correct. Managing agents are an unregulated industry, so they're not accountable. And because they're not accountable, they can operate as they see fit. There are two schemes. There's a property redress scheme they should be members of, or an ombudsman, who don't really have very much authority and are unhelpful in terms of managing the managing agent. So there's no one really there to manage the managing agent. And because of that fact, they can take advantage of leaseholders, overcharge them, increase service charges where they're not necessarily taking that money directly for work, increasing their own commission.
When we look at service charges and what's reasonable and what's not, for instance, let's take, again, one of these big blocks here. Let's say something happens to the exterior of that block, which makes it look slightly less unattractive. The freeholder wants to protect his asset as a freehold asset. I've no doubt the residents want it to look nice, but then comes the question of who pays. Does the freeholder pay, or does the service charge pay? Or in a lot of leases, whatever the freeholder decides to expend is reclaimable under that service charge. Is that not the case?
I think that is the case. Once you sign that lease, you are bound by the terms of it. And I believe the lease is sacrosanct. So repairing responsibilities are entrenched in that lease. Often is the case, flat owners are responsible for major work, repairs and maintenance. And the freeholder offloads those costs onto flat owners. That's often the case.
Yes. I mean, very careful not to mention the block, but I live in a block not too far from here. And we had, when the building was built, it had beautiful strip lighting all the way around the profile of the building, which lit up and flashed and all looked very good and all the rest of it. Mm. And 10 years on, it had deteriorated and none of it worked. And the freeholder particularly wanted it to look nice and all the rest of it, and wanted to spend £2.5 million, I think it was, on renewing this lighting. And there was a number of residents who said, oh yes, let's have that, until of course they realised the impact of the extra £2.5 million going on the service charge. Now I have to say I have a reasonably good freeholder, and there was a lot of discussion about how that cost could be mitigated or spread out or whatever else, so I shouldn't be too unkind on them. But that is the kind of problem that sort of rears its head. And for somebody who is struggling to pay the mortgage on an apartment with increased interest costs, or they're paying a high rent or whatever, these are critical matters, aren't they? These are matters that affect our living.
Yeah, I mean, the lighting, albeit it is aesthetic, but is it essential maintenance? I think service charges, obviously, they pay for a building to be maintained, including lighting. Some people struggle with hugely increased service charges. I'm wondering whether when they if a solicitor's explained to them when they buy their leasehold interest, they are responsible for contributing towards the external, the communal areas of a building. It appears to be the case that sometimes flat owners aren't aware of their responsibilities. And once they've signed a lease, once they've bought their property, the bills start coming in and they get quite shocked.
Yeah. Well, two points on that. I've been dealing in property for, seems like 100 years now, but it's not quite that. But I see so many times people have said, well, have you not read or didn't you listen to the report on title that you got when you were signing the deeds for buying the property? And they say, no, not really. And quite frankly, when you're buying a property, you're all excited about moving in. The only thing you want to get is the keys. The last thing you want to do is sit there listening to a solicitor droning on about responsibilities and
Absolutely.
and leasehold responsibilities as far as the service charge is concerned. So to an extent, it's often the residents' own fault that they don't understand these things. However, having said that, I'm very much against these matters being what I would call set in stone. I think there should be some flexibility and some logic behind some of these things that go on. And simply for a freeholder to pass everything over to the service charge with sort of carte blanche, I don't think it's the right way to approach it. I see still lots of leases, both long leases and short leases, being produced in the most inappropriate language because they've been cut and pasted from old leases onto new ones, and nobody's really interested to look, of course, until something goes wrong. And I think that's a problem that you must hit a lot of times.
I think there are unexpected costs which come whenever, and they have to be paid for. So I think once you sign a lease, you're bound by the terms of it. And responsibility for repairs generally does lie with flat owners, leaseholders. Freeholders, I suppose, are also guided by the lease that's been granted, and in some ways have to run with the leases.
Yeah.
I think flexibility is difficult.
I can see it, but I do think that the danger is here that we're just about to embark on legislation, or that legislation to become effective. This has actually really diminished the value of holding on to the freehold of a property. I think would you agree with that?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, once that value of that freehold becomes rather insignificant, the freeholder has got less and less interest in how it's going to look, how it runs, what happens to it, or anything else, because his revenue from it's gone right down, so therefore his interest has gone right down. How are we going to cope with that?
If freeholders are prepared to, freeholders should be transferred over to the leaseholders. If they're prepared to do it, as you say, with shrinking income, there's not such a great incentive to retain the freehold.
But conversely, if you're a set of residents thinking of taking on the freehold, my word would be watch it, because if you run out of money, you're in trouble. It's your asset that's going to start to look a bit dingy and a bit unattractive.
But it's a shared responsibility.
I suppose so, yeah. Okay, well, look, Phil, thank you for that. That's all we've got time for in this half of the show. So join me again after the break, and I'll be getting some more information from Phil on how we may deal with some of these problems. Hello, and welcome back to part 2 of Property Matters. I'm joined by Phil Crawford, who is a leasehold property expert, and very good to have you back, Phil.
Thank you.
We talked in the first half of some of the problems with managing agents and what happens if they don't do their job properly, and some of the little tricks and wriggles that the developers do to keep the service charges down to start with. But we have to move on, and we have to assume that people are in situ in their buildings, and some of these problems have come to light: excessive service charges, bad maintenance, etc. What I want to know from you, what are the consequences of these? Obviously, there's a monetary consequence in terms of a service charge rising, but does it have other effects on your property?
it could devalue properties if management don't look after the building. I think if there's management negligence, the whole building is affected. So that is a consequence. Another consequence is if the management company don't provide proper accounting, then lenders will not lend to a future buyer. So that is a problem. It's unsaleable. And banks are tightening up now with the questions they're asking through their solicitors about management behaviour and patterns of behaviour and how things have been managed in the last few years in terms of tenant disputes, tenants of Section 20 notices, and how service charge has been spent. So they want more questions answered, the banks.
There's also some banks are putting a restriction that if the service charge goes past the 1% point of the capital value of your property, again, they're not happy to fund that property. I mean, that could be quite damaging for a lot of people, especially down here, I can tell you.
Definitely more so down in London, where capital values are higher. If that is the case, then the properties are unsaleable. So you've got possibly different problems in the south, where you've got higher price value properties, and you've got higher service charges. Again, I think it depends what you're getting for that service charge. I mean, there are expensive items, and then some people who can afford and some who can't.
Well, I think one of the problems is that we've gone through a phase of wanting very sophisticated properties with all sorts of swimming pools and cinemas and gymnasiums and all kinds of things. Yeah. And people haven't really understood that costs money, and it costs even more money when it's time to refurb. I mean, it doesn't, a couple of million quid is neither here nor there to refurbish a sort of leisure facility in your building. If you're going to get to the 15, 20-year point where lifts start needed to be
big expenditure.
Big capital expenditure. You can be talking £250,000 a lift, and if you've got 4 or 6 of them in your building,
over £1 million,
that's big money.
Yeah.
So that's that. Now, what I'd like to also understand, you see problems and you deal with problems with service charge and leasehold matters right across the country. I'm interested to know, is there a sort of fiscal prevalence of these problems? So is it the top end of the market, the expensive flats, that the big problems come in? Or is it the bottom end where perhaps you've got a less caring, less responsible, less substantial landlord?
I think it's more so at the bottom end where people have less spare money and they're more likely to be aggrieved when service charges are increased. At the top end, perhaps for people who have more money, service charge is not such an issue, and they're able to pay it, possibly able to pay it, and they're not so worried about challenging service charge. So I think it's more the bottom end.
Oh, and what about sort of geographical prevalence? Do you get more of these problems in the north of England, where property prices are, as you said, a lot less up in the north of England? So are the problems greater in the north of England, or in London, conversely, are we just more used to dealing with these problems down here, being more used to leasehold?
I think there is more leasehold in London because there's more flats. There's Victorian properties all over, but older properties need more maintenance.
Yes, that's true.
And a lot of the properties I'm coming across in the north of England are Victorian. So maintenance is higher than newer buildings. I think there are less leaseholds in the north of England. There's a lot of freehold property, not flats, but houses. So that's the difference. In London, because of the lack of space, more flats are built. And flats are leasehold. They're rarely freehold. So capital values are higher and service charges are higher because of the capital values. Salaries you would expect to be higher with a London weighting. The capital values are out of the reach of a lot of people today to buy and for first-time buyers in the south of England, in London. Whereas in Manchester, it's more affordable.
Do you think that we should perhaps look to our architects to design rather more simplistic buildings, spend less on aesthetics, and have a more practical and sort of fundamental view of what and how we build? Because these problems that we've talked about have been around a long time.
Yeah.
And the way I see it, it's only going to get worse if we carry on as we are.
I think there's a lot to be said about a view from the street. People like to look at attractive buildings. Attractive buildings generally tend not to be simplistic. So I think curb appeal is a big factor. And it's difficult to see how simplistic architects can be more simplistic with buildings and attract the general public. I think the general public want the buildings that are being produced. That's what I think.
Yeah. I mean, I walk around the City of London sometime, which is, mainly commercial buildings.
Yes.
And I feel very proud of what's being left behind from this period in time. Some of the buildings are just absolutely stunning.
Yes.
But I also look at the people taking occupation of those buildings, and they're big corporations and people who can well afford the luxury of fancy architecture. But I look at some of the new buildings being built for residential purposes, and I just think to myself, if you simplified that design, if you cut out some of the things. I mean, I've mentioned my building. It's got a beautiful 2-story gym, Olympic-sized swimming pool, and
which isn't necessarily needed.
Well, I could take you over there now, and I guarantee there's not one person in there. I mean, that's the fact of it. I mean, it's all very nice to have, but the usage of it is just so minimal that it just doesn't make financial sense. So I just wonder whether we just need to be a bit more practical and a bit more basic in what we provide for the future, for future generations. Really,
it's like the flat you mentioned. It's become a destination for people to get together, to be able to go to like a media room together. But you said the gym's not used. If these services are not used, then it's costing people money, and it's a waste of money.
Yeah, but also
they're not necessary.
It's also pretty unusable space because it very rarely converts into anything practical.
Yeah.
So it really is a bit of a nonsense. It's a little bit like some of these buildings again down here. They build great big tower block. Underneath, they have to have through planning a Class D space, which is either going to be a nursery or something of public service, and the developers can't let it, and it has to sit there for 3 or 4 years while they argue with the council that they need to turn it into something commercial. So we're our own worst enemy to a degree in some of these building matters, and I just think we need to get back to building sensible, down-to-earth buildings. Doesn't mean we don't have to have nice buildings elsewhere or whatever else, but we need to consider, the generations to come and what they can afford and what's going to happen.
I think we are dogged by planning restrictions. Planning is difficult in Britain. It's slow and it's awkward.
Yeah. Well, on that subject, just on our final subject of the programme, Phil, the government have brought in the Leasehold Reform Act. I think that's still what it's called.
It's the Renters Reform Bill.
No, there is the Renters Reform Bill.
The Leasehold Reform Act.
So the Leasehold one,
sorry,
I'm just referring to. Do you think the ideas of streamlining planning and building a 1.5 million homes by the end of this Parliament, do you think they're really practical?
It's never going to happen.
It's not, is it?
1.5 million homes, never going to happen. It's not happened for the last 5 years. There's no real prospect of it happening.
No.
Sadly.
Well, I think my question always was when Dave and George used to come out with their high-vis jackets on and the hard hats and say, we're going to build 500,000 homes. I always wanted to say, well, who's we? But there we are. Phil, I'm going to say thank you very much for coming in today. It's
pleasure.
Been very informative. And
thank you for having me.
I'm sure many of our viewers will be very grateful for the information that you've imparted today.
Hope so.
So, thank you, Phil Crawford. Thank you for watching. I'm Stephen Galpin. Join me again next time on Property Matters.